Hello, Vartan. Thank you. And before I begin, I just want to say Shunor Agalim to you and to the Armenian Radio Hour for having me and for that generous introduction. It's a very good question, actually, and I've asked that myself in terms of why pursue such a topic and spend so many years and so much work on it. And it really started from my childhood. In 1985, I was 11 years old, and I went to my first April 24th commemoration in Surp Vartan Cathedral. It was the first one my parents had taken me to. And I didn't really know what was going on at the time, naturally, and the concept of genocide was not something that I could fathom at that time. But as I entered college and grew into adulthood, I continued to attend these events, and that's when I began to wonder, well, how long has this been going on? Why are the Armenians still holding demonstrations and rallies so many decades after the genocide's conclusion? And I realized that no one really had the answers. And today we've inherited the trauma of the genocide and the burden of that wound. Certainly not like the survivors, but it's still there. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about it anymore. But we've also inherited a cause that is sometimes demands of us to participate in political advocacy or to participate in demonstrations, but also a cause that often leads to frustration and anger that this injustice remains. And I wanted to find the origins and evolution of this cause, and I thought it's something that my generation deserved to know, and that future generations deserve to know. And because no one else has really written about it, that's what gave me the final impetus to work on this project.
When you speak about the origins, what did your research bring to light? You just a few minutes ago we were talking about the book. You mentioned that's a very unique book. Nobody had written about this topic. What is the uniqueness of the book?
Well, if you look at the genocide literature, and there have been some great works done by scholars like Richard Hovhannisyan and Dadrian and Taner Akçam and Peter Balakian, and a lot of my research built on what they had done. But their works tend to kind of come to a conclusion in the 1920s or early 1930s. And no one has really looked at what happened to the Armenians after that in regard to the genocide. And what I wanted to look at were two themes that are the central focus of my book. And the first is the genocide was a widely acknowledged event when it was taking place. There are more than 100 articles in the New York Times alone. And it was also an event that inspired this massive international humanitarian aid movement, which ultimately culminated in the Near East Relief Foundation. And for an American child growing up in the 1920s, they would have often heard their parents say, finish the food on your plate, 'cause don't forget the starving Armenians. So I asked myself, well, if that was the case, then how did this event disappear from the world's consciousness? There's the Hitler quote from 1939, where he is addressing the German army on the eve of invasion, and he orders them to be ruthless and show no mercy. And for anyone who doubts the wisdom of his command, he tells them who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians. Now, Armenians have often cited that quote as a sign of the cost of impunity in regard to the perpetrators of the genocide. But it's also a quote that reveals how the world had moved on. After showing so much compassion and sympathy for the Armenians, after so much political advocacy that tried to get the Armenians reparations and establish them a homeland, the world moved on and this event disappeared. And if you just even look at the newspaper accounts in American newspapers in the 1940s and 50s, there's hardly any mention of the genocide. And it's not as if Armenians aren't written about. There are thousands of articles in the major newspapers, and I'm talking New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, thousands of articles about Armenians, but almost nothing about the Armenian genocide, and rarely anything about the Armenian genocide that deals with its political dimensions. Whenever it was written about, it was often written about, let's say, an obituary of an Armenian who happened to be a survivor, or something like that. So you ask yourself, well, how could this be? How could the world have forgotten? And what were the Armenians doing in terms of trying to sustain the memory of the genocide? So that's one of the two things that I really focus on, is how this event, as I said, which was so well known when it took place, disappear from the world's consciousness, and what role did the Armenians play in that disappearance. And the second half of my book looks at the origin of this modern campaign for justice. That includes demonstrations, legislative actions, battles in the media. It seems like no matter where Armenians and Turks collide, there seems to be a battle over the genocide and this dueling histories between these two people. So the second half of my book really looks at how that began in the mid-1960s and how it evolved to the present day.